Right, thank you all for joining us today in Oodi Library. We're having a panel discussion related to an exhibition at Mimilakak's gallery, a show I had the pleasure of visiting the other day and was led through by Tere Chad, if I may call you by your artist name. She asked me to jump in to moderate this session because the previous chairperson or moderator wasn't able to make it. I'm not sure what happened, but I myself am not a specialist in this field, and I think maybe that will be to the advantage of this panel, perhaps, because I will ask all kinds of stupid questions, which you will be able to explain to the audience, but might not know as much as they do. So I have the pleasure of first. I'm going to introduce myself. Maybe I'll do that last. I'll first introduce the panelists. Pirita Na, if I may say that, yes, if I didn't mispronounce it completely, is a member of the Sami Parliament in Finland and Mergers and Acquisitions Director at EY Parthenon across the road, who combined a unique profile, international business career at several different large-scale companies I won't read out, and indigenous rights advocacy. I think we're probably more interested in the second, but the first part might be weigh heavily on the discussion. She holds an MSc in economics from the Helsinki University of Economics and MSc in media and communications from the London School of Economics, and is a supernumerary PhD student at Sibelius Academy, focusing on Sami yoik and cultural appropriation. She was named the Sami of the Year in 2017 and is also one of the founding members of the Faktaluva blog. Pirkka yoiked and acted in the short film The Killing of Chacharauga, I'm mispronouncing this, which showcased in Finland's Pavilion in Venice Biennale 2019, which I had the pleasure of attending. It was a very interesting show, very diverse. We can get back to that later, perhaps. Teivo Teivainen, an old friend and distinguished professor of world politics at the University of Helsinki, has been a visiting professor at many universities in South and North America. His academic work has been awarded internationally with the Hopkins Prize of the American Sociological Association and Amartya Sen Prize of Yale University. In between, he has received Academy of Finland Recognition Award, Pro-Feminism Award, J.V. Snellman Public Information Award, and Ovid Award. I'm sure we're missing something. There must be many more awards, like being liked by most of us here. He regularly appears on TV and radio programs, and his interviews range from the New York Times, Financial Times, or Shinhao News to smaller media outlets in various parts of the world. He currently leads Academy of Finland project on transnational social movements. Teivo also is, as I know well, is one of the founding members of the World Social Forum, at least part of that, and has also been part of several of the more engaged movements in art, so has done city walks related to Pussy Riot, for example, here in Helsinki, and so I think it's interesting also from an artistic point of view to see engaged academics. So Axel Straschnoy is a visual artist and filmmaker. We have an artist with us here from Buenos Aires, based in Helsinki for some time, and his story of reaching here is a quite interesting one. I think it was via several other countries, including Germany, and his work deals with social practices surrounding objects of knowledge. His long-term research projects span planetarium films, performances, film installations, editions, traveling exhibitions, museum collections, and virtual reality films. So you're interested in expeditions, I'm told, literal and metaphorical, scientific and artistic. I think we'll get to that. Straschnoy has participated in the Le Pavillon residency of Palais de Tokyo and trained in art history at the University of Buenos Aires. And finally on the panel is Tere Chad, who I think we have to thank for this panel in the first place, is the organizer of the exhibition and curator at Mimilakak's, is a Chilean artist based in London, curator of Neo Norte 3.0 exhibition currently being showcased at Mimilakak's. Her research is focused on sustainability and how geopolitics affects Latin American identity. She holds an MA in Art and Science from Central St. Martin's, University of the Arts London, and graduated in 2020 from the MA Sculpture at the Royal College of Art in London. She has exhibited her work widely, and among her latest exhibitions is worth mentioning In My Dreams solo exhibition at Zari Gallery, Fitzrovia, London, and her outdoor sculpture Are We Sinking, exhibited in June at the Sculpture Terrace of the Royal Society of Sculptors in Chelsea, also London. So thank you very much for organizing this. I haven't written my bio, but I'll just say I'm Ivor Stodolsky. I'm a curator, a writer. I have been also an academic in previous lives and in high politics, if you like. I used to be an editor for something called Project Syndicate, which distributes high-level opinion pieces by politicians and Nobel Prize laureates and the likes internationally. So I have some experience with geopolitics. I also have some experience with art, and I run an organization with my co-founder Marita Mulkunen that's called Artists at Risk, and we have bases in 20 places around the world where we host artists who have to flee their countries for reasons of being persecuted for their political activities, their gender, their ethnicity, or other such reasons. And we're founding another new project which is called Ecologists at Risk. I might mention it now since the continent we're going to be referring to is one of the prime places where ecologists are at risk in incredible high numbers. So ecologists are being killed at a rate much higher than even journalists. So this is my current kind of occupation, is to work with these people at risk. So thank you for inviting me to facilitate. I think we would like to start with Neo Norte. I would like, if you may, could you just give us a brief introduction to the history of the exhibition, Neo Norte 1, 2, and now 3?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Ivor. At my back, you can see a video with glimpses of the exhibition. The exhibition is still going to be on for a week more, so you're more than welcome to come. We're also having a guided tour this Sunday, and we will have a couple of events. So you're welcome to check them on my Instagram, or you can ask me for an invitation at the end of the panel or a catalog. And Neo Norte was born actually in 2017, I would say, because I was studying in London at Central St. Martin's, and I was approached by a group of Latin Americans with the idea of building a society to reframe or rethink Latin American identity, because sometimes what happens, and in that regard I do feel that geopolitics affect, is that this idea that when we grow up in the place that is the end of the world, we are taught that we have less possibilities than people who are maybe in Europe or the north of the world. So I somehow think that part of the underdevelopment is because children are being raised since their childhood with the preconception that they're not going to have possibilities because everything will be better either in Europe or North America. So, and I was very surprised that in a place like London, that's so cosmopolitan, there's still a lack of knowledge about Latin America, and people have a very narrow stereotype sometimes. So that's why I felt like if I have had the possibility to be abroad, then there's also a responsibility to promote our culture and bring up a different conversation. So we started with this Latinos Creative Society, and we started researching about different manifestos and theories and what authors have written about it. And then we arrived to Joaquín Torres Garcia, who is an Uruguayan artist, and he proposed the idea of the Escuela del Sur, or School of the South, and he was saying that instead of being with this nostalgia of always wanting to be like part of Europe or North America, why don't we see the South as our North? And it's the idea of turning them upside down. So then we did several of activities with this Latinos Creative Society, and we also won a funding, and we did our first exhibition at the Crypt Gallery in Euston in London in 2018. And with that, I had enough of a portfolio that I could apply for a place in Chile, to Fundación Cultural de Providencia, to present Neo Norte 1. For me, it was very important that the first edition of Neo Norte was presented in South America and not in Europe, because normally what happens is that the exhibitions are first in Europe and North America, and then we have to wait like 10 years in Latin America so that they arrive to Latin America. And for me, the idea was doing it differently. An idea that comes from the south travels north. So then after a successful presentation in 2018, I was invited to present again Neo Norte 2 in exposed arts projects in London in 2019. And we also had a smaller placement in Central St. Martin's. And then after that, there was a curator from Mumala Gallery, Ramiro Camelo, who traveled to Fries in London, and he visited the exhibition because it was at the same time. And he invited me to present Neo Norte 3 in Helsinki, which has been actually quite challenging because we have encountered both Brexit and COVID. So all the planning has been done with the uncertainty of not knowing if it was actually going to happen. And that's why, I mean, there's some of the sponsors and partners in the panel, and I want to thank them because actually they have believed in the idea and the project, and that it has all happened, which is almost a miracle actually. So Neo Norte, one of the, like, I would say one of the challenges that brings up is that most likely, and I might say something that some people in the audience might disagree, and they're welcome then afterwards to maybe disagree or ask things. But I find it very sad sometimes that in museums in Latin America still there's a big segregation between what could be called ethnic art or indigenous art and what could be called contemporary art that is more commonly associated to Western expressions. And normally, like, indigenous art is usually placed in the ethnic museum or the ethnological museum or the pre-Columbian museum in a kind of like inferior category. And I think that this somehow produces a lot of conflict within society because people feel displaced. And of course, if museums and our educational system is not giving a space for these communities, of course, then you have lots of social conflicts. So I think there's a responsibility of presenting a different narrative and inviting for more open integration of the different communities. And that doesn't mean that one community is superior than the other. It's about opening up dialogues and having an integration. And so one of the challenges I have done through Neo Norte, and I have had encounters with some more like academic curators that they disagree with my perspective, is that I have mixed and invited people who come from indigenous backgrounds and also people who come from Western backgrounds, and even people who are not Latin Americans, but they are also interested in the topic. Then the other thing, I guess, with COVID and digitalisation, the idea of like geopolitics somehow dissipate, because we're living in a flat world with this digitalization, because now we're having Zoom meetings with people in any part of the world. So I think that makes even more interesting the concept of Neo Norte and thinking how geopolitics affect the way we think and the way we conceive our own identity. And then the other thing that for me was a discovery when I came to Helsinki last year to do the research of the project was getting to know more about the Sami community and finding lots of parallels between the struggles of the Sami community in Finland, which, as far as I know, is the only indigenous community in Europe, and finding parallels between displaced communities in Latin America. So then that's why we came up with the idea of doing this panel discussion tonight at Oodi, where we could have a cross conversations between the connections or dissimilarities as well between the extreme north and the extreme south. So, well, I guess, yeah, you can continue, Ivor.
Thank you very much, Tere. I think we should try to get the discussion going within the panel, perhaps by asking you, Pirita, like how you relate to this concept of somehow the status of being actually very, very far north, and them trying to turn the continent upside down and claim the north for themselves, and how you feel about this travel from the north to the south, so to speak, or the other way, and how that relates to your traditional culture, perhaps?
A lot of questions there, but all very relevant and all really interesting. And this idea of turning the map upside down is, of course, really fascinating, and something that we do as well to show that North is the center of the universe for us, Arctic indigenous peoples, like the Sami people. And in a way, when we're talking about the global South and the global North, then in the context of Finland and in the Nordic countries and Russia, of course, us indigenous peoples are in the North. So they're kind of, the concepts are turned around anyway. Then when it comes to traveling, again, a lot of aspects there. First of all, the concept of traveling in the indigenous contexts often means nomadic life, and that's what we used to lead in different scales. So, for example, nomadic reindeer herding Sami, who I belong to, we used to migrate with our reindeer between the inland and the sea shore. And that would happen across the borders of the nation states that we nowadays call or have among us. And then even within smaller communities, there would have been separate places where you spent the summer and you spent the winter, and that was due to the natural conditions. So obviously in the summer you get food and subsistence from different kind of environment than in the winter. And it's also a way of ensuring that you are using the land in a sustainable way. So in the winter you use certain area, in the summer you use another area and leave the winter pastures protected for the time being. The same idea as with the reindeer migration. Then coming to the contemporary Sami life, I share my time between Inari and between Helsinki. Inari is my home village. You can look it up on the map if you're not familiar with it. We're 330 kilometers above the Arctic Circle, so really north, the extreme north. And then there are many Sami like myself who are educated and have found a place to work in the south, but we feel a big obligation to give back to our community, and not only give back, but also to be involved with our language and cultures, and there are different ways of doing that. And at the moment I have the, how would you say it in English, poliittinen nakki, so I've been given the task of looking after the politics for a while, but there are many people who, for example, live here in the south, but they work with culture, movies, music, education, poetry, whatever, and that takes them back to the north, and sometimes again back to the south. So this is very typical in the contemporary Sami life.
Thank you very much, Pirita. I think at some point we're going to relate this to another indigenous kind of movement, rather, that I discussed also in advance with some of the panelists that are currently invading Europe, the Zapatistas. But perhaps bear that in mind for a moment while we turn to our next panelist, Axel. We often visit exhibitions without acknowledging how artworks have traveled. You've made a project called Le Rappel à l'Ordre, the call to order. Could you perhaps think of that in that context and elaborate on that, or perhaps related to the other story you were telling us about Germany and Ludwig Museum before the panel started?
Okay. Well, it's a lot more prosaic maybe than what we have been discussing so far. I've always, it's maybe has to do with my own career, or how to say, study as an artist. I've always been interested in thinking about how an idea or a project or an artwork meets a space, and I noticed that at some point that it would be advisable, let's say, to make projects that are more neutral towards the space and travel easier. So I was thinking, okay, how do projects travel? And I was realizing I was making maybe film in different ways, but I was thinking that the work that the traveling form by excellence is the single channel film, the one screen film, because I can just you can watch it on your mobile phone. I can send it to you. It's very easy to watch anywhere. It has no weight. It travels. And I was thinking that it would be interesting to make a single channel film, which is the traveling form by excellence, about the difficulties of transporting artworks. So I basically spent time in 9 museums in the Baltics, here in Finland, and also in Argentina, documenting how they moved works from one place to the other, and made it into a very traveling film. So it travels a lot lighter than what you see on the screen. And of course, it was interesting to see the difference between Finland, let's say the Baltics, and Argentina. There's quite a few cultural differences about how works travel. But you realize that if in the end, it doesn't matter what the work it is, it has to fit in a box. So I thought it was interesting how, you know, whatever you do, you just have to find the right box to fit it so it can travel.
Okay, and so that as actually some thoughts that we might entertain leading from that is the size of the box. So maybe that Teivo would be able to, as also somebody with a philosophical turn of mind, think of universalism as a kind of box, you know, a European box that we have the standard sizes. Whatever it is, we don't mind the content. It's all diversity, but just fit it in this box and it'll be called human. I'm just ad-libbing, if you like. I have another question I could ask you, but would you like to reflect on that while I read you the other one? So you often change the format of your lectures. Could you tell us how you came up with the idea of organizing the World Political City Walk? So this is a very different question, but I think this box question might be important for the issue of how things travel and whether they really are commendable.
Good and difficult questions. Maybe about all right. Yeah, thank you. So boxes and walking and asking
and
questions when walking. Yes, perhaps I've been organizing something called World Political City Walks, and in those walks, one of the ideas has been to try to explore some of these things about culture and hegemony and geopolitics. Like in Finland, we tend to think there's this idea, and you can see many signs of that when you walk the city of Helsinki, like, oh, we've been poor and, you know, colonized by the Russians and the Swedes, and so somehow there's this idea in Finland that we have affinity with the global south and the poor of the world and the indigenous people, and Finland in international arenas helps the poor and the indigenous. And then when you start looking at that Finland is today, when Finland has sort of jumped many scales in the sort of hierarchy of the world system, and then how actually Finland acts in many things, like for example about the Sami, like not ratifying the most important convention of the International Labour Organization's Convention 169, while preaching that we love the indigenous people and we help them, but we're not going to ratify the most important convention here about the Sami here. And of course, we want to help the poor of the world, but when we get the power in the World Bank, we're not going to do anything to let the poor to have more power, because then we would have less power and we are rich. So when you start looking at that kind of way Finland has traveled from this idea of having affinity with the global south to this position of defending privileges of the north against the poor and against the indigenous people here and in the world, then that sort of contradiction sort of appears as something I try to scratch when I walk the city. There are many ways to do it near here, ranging from racism in front of railway station against there are always an occasion to chat with the police about how they make ethnic profiling there or something like that, and there's UPM cooperation right next to us and all kinds of nice things here. So how to fit this in a box and universalism and all that, it's a huge question. Maybe I talked already too much, so let's get back to that.
Right, we'll get back to that. The idea was to, I think that's very relevant, because there are these universal boxes, such as, you know, development for the world. We love indigenous people. We're one of the most advanced nations. We respect human rights. Finland, I think only yesterday, or was it today, became one of the members of the UN Council on Human Rights. And it's written large in the program of this wonderful Prime Minister in Finland currently, which everyone respects for being a young woman and so on and so forth. But de facto, Finland has actually not funded the human rights organizations properly. I know this very well from the point of view of a human rights organization based in Finland, where we have approached various ministries, and they didn't even know themselves that human rights was one of the main points of the pillars of the program of the government, and had no spare funding for this, and is currently cutting the arts, which is one of the few fields in which these kind of things can be elaborated and discussed. So there is a very big gap between what box you put it in and what's inside it. But my question was a little bit different. Was like, is it really possible to put all of these things in the same kind of standard box that Axel said all artworks can be fit into? And that's a more philosophical question we can try to answer perhaps as we go on. So Tere Chad, again, we would like to kind of go back to the exhibition a little bit. And so, you've been organizing this in the context of COVID-19. It's been a kind of difficult time. So you would like to talk about that a little bit, perhaps, or also to understand if at the moment, and this is where I'd like to perhaps introduce it, there's this tendency in Europe and in the North to reformulate a lot of traditional discourse about the South from being how we brought Enlightenment, and it used to be Christianity was a positive thing, and now we have a very different picture of this, that it was a form of an ideology of colonization, of oppression, of rape and pillage. European concepts of the South have changed very radically over the last few years only, and we have very big debates surrounding the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. We have a change of the Columbus Day to the Indigenous Day only 3-4 days ago in the United States. So there's many big changes happening in the North, and in this context, coming from the South and saying, well, we need to re-evaluate how the South is seen in the South. How do you see that change?
Well, first, answering to your first question about COVID, of course it has been challenging because I've been almost more than a year trying to somehow sell air, because I was trying to convince the sponsors but not really knowing if the exhibition was going to be possible or not. What for me gave me always a kind of relief was knowing that Mummalakaksi has been open the whole time during COVID, and just maybe the only thing I knew was maybe some events were going to be shifted online, or maybe there was a possibility of not having a private view and having limited groups of people visiting. I knew that there were some ways going around, but even having preparing the trip, I think was more challenging actually Brexit than COVID, because before Brexit you could just travel in Europe with the artworks with no problems, and now, I mean, the problem is that nobody knows really how to get the documentation. So I was receiving calls from the London Chamber of Commerce saying to me oh, I would not recommend you to do the paperwork in advance because regulations change every day. And then I felt I thought I was living in Europe in the first world. I thought this was the kind of things that happen in Latin America, not here. But this was a bit of a nightmare in terms of getting the paperwork done really. And of course, because it also adds an extra cost to the project, which I think it's already, the funding for art is very limited. So having to pay for clearance documents for an art exhibition, that's not really a very commercial project. It makes it a bit sad because it somehow reduces the cultural exchange and the cultural possibilities of exchanging ideas, because I think that it has been both enriching for me as a curator based in London to come here, but I also think, I hope, that for the local community it has also been something positive because we're having this conversation tonight. So I think that for me was a big challenge. But going back up to the idea of reframing the South, I guess in the world we're kind of going through very revolutionary moments, because we're kind of in a moment where there's a lot of political instability, especially Latin America. Of course, always poor places, they suffer more than places like here, where you have stronger institutions. And we somehow realize that capitalism is not working as a system, but on the other hand, communism is not an option either. So we're shifting into a kind of system that we don't know what it is. And I guess it has to do a lot with the impact of social media, the impact of artificial intelligence, the climate crisis, and I could continue with that. But when thinking about the idea of reframing the South, on the one hand, I think that even though it's fundamental to acknowledge history, I think we cannot judge history with the eyes from today. I think that's always a mistake, because you have to understand it was a different context. I think it's important to acknowledge it, but not to try to find a judgment, because if not, you end up in an endless war of arguments. But then I do think that there's a big challenge, especially in Latin America, of embracing and giving space to communities that have been displaced for centuries. Because still you have in Latin America like the old European classes who are the rulers and communities who are struggling. But then the problem is that some of these communities, sometimes they get associated with terrorism, and then people think like, oh, all these people are terrorists, and which is not true, and then this kind of conflicts arise. And in that regard, for me, what I think is maybe the most important part that I can contribute from an artistic perspective is giving a space for dialogue for different communities, but presenting each of the pieces as contemporary artworks. And going back to the Humboldt Forum that you said in Berlin, one of the pieces that we have in the exhibition is actually, I know that the museum was going to be placed there, but I'm not sure if it has already been opened or not, the Ethnological Museum of Berlin, because they were going to reopen the new museum, and I'm not sure with COVID if they reopen it or not. But the Ethnological Museum of Berlin has loaned some ethnomusicological archives from a tribe from Patagonia, the Selknam, who was extinguished during a genocide between the 19th and 20th century, which is a very sad story. And relating to one of the things that Pirita said, what I think it's relevant here about the story, and then it's when I think that's important to acknowledge history, is that this, one of the reasons why this community was extinguished was because they didn't understand the traditional, the concept from the West of the private property. Because there was a group of British that went to settle to Patagonia, and they were rearing their sheep and cattle, and these indigenous that were the Selknam and other tribes, they went and hunted the sheep because they thought it was just food. And then this group of British decided to go and hunt the natives. And there was a competition where they were sending the skulls to London, and this was just 19th, 20th century, so I'm not speaking from very far ago. And I think it does relate to what Pirita was mentioning about how the Sami community they don't conceive the borders as maybe Western democracies conceive the borders. And I think that with this digitalisation, a new conception of limits and borders is also arises. I don't know if I've answered your question, Ivor.
That's quite a lot that you've already put on the table. I think it's a good contribution, very, very interesting also about relating it to kind of like tribes that don't exist anymore, the archivization of their past in ethnographic museums. It has been moved. Dahlem Museum did move to the center of Berlin, and it's rather problematic. I think this is worth kind of, I'll use my position as a facilitator to add a bit more data to that kind of, there's very important information there, that the centerpiece of the most powerful country in the most powerful, well, it's one of the most powerful continents, Europe. Germany is the most powerful country. Berlin is its capital. In the center of Berlin is the Humboldt Forum, which is a reconstruction of a Prussian militarist palace, which says on its dome in enormous letters that everything above land, on land, and under land shall bow its knee to Jesus Christ. It's a perfectly colonial thing. And inside it are the stolen masks and artifacts from indigenous people around the world. And they've been very, very, the German authorities realized in the 1980s that there was something called Provenienzforschung, which means finding the provenance of the artifacts, which some will even say are not artifacts, they're not artworks, they're actually just animate objects. In any case, they, at this point, were smart enough, as good German archivists, they had archived everything according to number and date and so on and so on and so on, when it had been taken, stolen, or acquired, and destroyed the archive. So they erased the provenance of these works, and then only in recent years have employed very few researchers, many of them just PhDs, to reconstruct this. So it's been kind of a systematic erasure of the history of the objects in this museum. And they're selling it, again, just like Teivo was saying about Finland, the kind of, the surface kind of image is very different from the content. They're selling this as a dialogue of cultures, how Germany is trying to open up to the world and admit its crimes and how bad they were and so on and so forth, at the same time as perpetuating this and rebuilding a kind of imperial past in the center of Europe. It's very problematic, and there have been many demonstrations about this by many important artists already, and it goes on. So I think this is something you can look at it. There's many articles about, also on Humboldt Forum's website. You can check it out. I'll share it with you if you like. So sorry for that little aside there. I wanted to though turn back to you, Pirita, and ask, well, what how would the Sami people relate to indigenous peoples of other continents? So in Latin America, we have many undocumented even. I mean, there are some that haven't been at least contacted with European or kind of our present-day civilizations, haven't really intervened in their everyday life. How do you feel about their life there, and how would you propose that we continue to kind of not disturb it or interact, or how would you see that complex?
Well, in many ways, for example, us, the Sami, as an indigenous people, as an Arctic indigenous people, we relate a lot more with the other indigenous peoples of the world than, let's say, the Finns, because we share the same struggles, the same history of colonialism, the same attempts to decolonize, and most importantly, the same goal of getting self-determination. And that is really a unifying message and unifying objective of the indigenous peoples across the world, and also in Latin America. And for example, we at the Sami Parliament, we work, I could almost say, almost daily with other indigenous peoples around the world, with some of them more intensively and more actively, but anyway, for example, through the UN Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues, the Sami people have a long history of working together with other indigenous peoples. And we feel a lot of solidarity to the different struggles around the world. And you can say that when we hear about the stories and what is happening around the world, it always sounds so familiar, what has happened with land that has been taken from us, colonization, how we've been put to educational institutions a long way from home, the negative impact that has had on our languages, the continuation of our culture and so on. The stories that we hear from Canada or from Australia or wherever, they're just like our stories. And you can imagine that when we have gone through the same experiences, that really unites you. And we don't share those experiences with the Finns, for example, during the independence of Finland, because the power relations have been so that there is a system, there is a society in Finland that has been built solely on one culture and one way of thinking, although the land is shared. So part of Finland is obviously on the Sami land. And then I had one more thought that I wanted to say. So self-determination, that is something that is the priority of all indigenous peoples. And it doesn't mean that we necessarily want to have our own states or countries, but it's more, it's a question of having the power to influence our own destiny and to make decisions over all sorts of things that have a major influence on ourselves, and most importantly land, because our cultures are so connected to the land. And I want to tell just a brief story. Now that during the COVID pandemic I've been in the north, so I was working the whole corona time from the north, and I come from a reindeer herding family, and I've had a lot more time to spend with our reindeer and tending them. It's been also some difficult winters where it's been hard for the reindeer to get through the really thick snow and ice to get food, so we've had to feed them. And I've been going to feed our reindeer quite a lot and spending time with them and kind of just watching them and looking at them. And what I've been thinking, especially in the spring when the snow has just melted and you see the barren Arctic tundra, so to speak, where there's nothing growing yet. But reindeer are able to find food in that land and in that environment. It's really humbling when you think about it, that without those animals, there would have been little chance of us being able to live in the north. And that's why it's so important still for us that we can continue with our traditional livelihoods. It's really extraordinary if you think about it. It's really bare in the land, and there is this miraculous animal that is able to feed and find food, like kind of on the stones even, and kind of on the land that is barely frozen. So a reflection on self-determination and our livelihoods.
Thank you very much for that. Are there any immediate responses? Does anybody want to jump in? We open the floor to that at any time. But perhaps if you just have a question in general, then we could save it for later. Right away? Okay.
Do you think the Finnish state has committed cultural genocide against the Sami? I say that because I have met Mikael Nakalajärvi at a party and asked, how do you say cheers in Sami? He didn't know. Well, this is a fact that, ask my question, yeah.
So the question was about cultural genocide and whether the Finnish state has committed such atrocities towards the Sami. I would say yes, unfortunately. During the independence of Finland, everything, the educational systems, the healthcare, the society at large has been built on Finnish values and Finnish way of thinking without taking the Sami culture into the structures. And that has led to, for example, a lot of families losing the Sami language, which is really central to our identity and our culture and our way of being. And I don't use the word cultural genocide lightly, but when you start kind of peeling the different layers of the onion, you get the obvious things, taking of the land, taking of the Sami drums. They're somewhere in the German and British and Norwegian museums. We don't own any of our drums anymore. Taking of the language, taking of all sorts of things. But also what has been taken away from us is our way of being and our way of knowing. Because when you strip away our nature-based religion, you start stripping away the foundations of the whole culture. And it's just amazing how the Sami culture has been able to survive. And I'm personally really thankful for the generations that have carried our culture and have given, for example, the Sami language for me. And I feel a great obligation to carry that forward to the next generations. So the answer is yes, unfortunately.
Please, Teivo.
Maybe just to add a bit on that, from Finnish perspective, and this thing about Finland's situatedness in the north or in the south. Like 120 years ago, and around that time, before the independence, there was this thing in Finland, like I may generalize a bit here, but many of the elites feeling like, why don't the other Europeans see us as white Europeans? Why do they think we are a Mongol race? Because the language, our strange language, was connected in racial theories with us being non-European. So, and when the story was that in Germany or in Italy or in the United States, in school books, when they paint countries, Africa black and Germany white, Finland would be yellow like China and Mongolia. And it was like, no, don't paint us yellow. We want to be white. We are white. Look, the Sami, the natives in the north, they are the non-white European natives. And look at the Russians, they are Asians. We are white Europeans like Germans. And by the way, we have some similar symbols too. So that was the kind of story around Finland's independence. Whether genocide and the concepts there, that's then,
And can I just add one thing? I want to emphasize that someone might say that, but Finland, surely the Finnish state, only 100 years old, is not cannot be blamed for all the things that happened in the past. Yes, and no, because Finland had the chance and has had the chance for 100 years to include the Sami better and include other minorities better also in the structures of the society. And I hope that within the next 100 years that's going to happen, that now we are kind of ripe enough as a country that we can start including others as well. So there were decisions made 100 years ago.
No, I'd like to we can get to discussion in a moment. I would like to kind of take it from there and go forward to this future question. And I think this is really important because at the moment, we've been talking about the nation state. We're talking about countries that somehow are units which are extinguishing their minorities. And so in every country of Europe, there have been certain parts of the country which have been flattened by the central power, France being the first nation state. It destroyed all of its local languages in order to have, the nation, the grande nation. And in Finland, of course, which is hardly discussed until recently, is the Karelians were very much oppressed, perhaps even more than the Sami people. They were completely wiped out. Their language was destroyed. There's hardly any left. So there's many of those stories. But I want to go forwards and think about the new power of our generation, of our century. And that is, if we have to give it a name, it is corporate power. And that's why it's interesting to look at corporations as forms of countries, if you like, a new entity that it has a state structure of some kind, which is fully undemocratic. It's a hierarchical, autocratic organizational structure. And you yourself combine those two within one. So I wanted to kind of just make it a little bit more difficult for ourselves by asking this question. Teivo mentioned UPM, Finnish company in Latin America, and you work with accounting and auditing companies, which are part of a mechanism for building a railway from Helsinki all the way through to the north, cutting lands that are Sami lands, as I understand, in half, making reindeer migrations difficult. How do you see this future state, the corporate state, kind of interfering with people's and indigenous rights and so on? And then we can maybe ask
the corporates have huge power and, long story, but I'll try to be brief. So from a personal point of view, I want to be part of the change, and there is a huge change happening in the corporate world and in the commercial world. I've been working in business for about 12, 15 years, whatever, and during that time I've seen a huge change. And even during the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a huge change, and companies and corporations are driving a huge sustainability and green agenda, and of course it's some of it is greenwashing and it's probably not real, but there is a lot of things that corporations can do, and I have to say that I feel conflicted sometimes, because I've been sent to a British boarding school and then I've continued to study business and so on, and I've climbed the corporate ladder and I am where I am at the moment, and at the same time I have really strong connection to my Sami values and to my Sami culture. But I think the answer is not to shy away, say, oh, I can't be in the corporate world because I'm a strong indigenous advocate. The idea is that I work within that framework and try to do my best, and I'm only a little bit, but I'll try to become a bit bigger fish in the Finnish corporate pond, let's say that. So maybe that can start answering that question.
Axel, you've been on the sidelines here of this discussion, but you had an exhibition or a project called La Figure de la Terre, which might relate to this topic, or would you like to join on another issue?
Well, it's not really the corporate world there, but
no.
But yeah, it's I feel very difficult to have an opinion on the Sami issue because I don't know and I don't want to speak about things I don't know. I think it's the best thing to do. But that was a film about Tornio, that took place in Tornio when Tornio was the white people's border in 1736. There was a French scientist called Maupertuis who came to Finland to measure So he wanted to know the length of a one degree, the linear length of 1 degree, in order to know whether the Earth was flat at the equator, flat at the top, or a perfect sphere. People, of course, knew that it was not flat anymore, but what kind of shape did it really have? There was a discussion within France, and Maupertuis came to the Tornio River Valley to measure there. And in a way, he was the person who determined that the Earth is flat at the poles, which is, for the understanding of the Earth, quite an interesting story, but quite little known. I didn't know the story even after living maybe 10 years here, and I found out many Finnish people don't know the story at all. But to me, what was interesting, well, in that film, which maybe does not really connect to the issue at hand, is that I found a man who is the biggest expert in the world on this story, but he also has a very personal relationship to Maupertuis. He's almost like a doppelganger of Maupertuis. So in a way, we flattened time and we went through the stories, but what's interesting for this discussion is that when Maupertuis was not only a very good scientist, but he was also someone who was great at telling stories, not necessarily all of them true. And when he went back to France, to Paris, and he was talking in salons about his adventures in the dangerous lands of Tornio, and how he climbed the dangerous tall mountain of Avasaxa, which is 250 meters tall, and it's like this. And he went down the rapids that no other local dared to go on the boat, and so on. But he created parts of the myths in Europe about the people of the north. He talked about, I'm trying to remember the name of the fell. Well, he specifically wrote about one fell that looked like inhabited by fairies, and I think there was a British poet who talked about this fell in Lapland inhabited by fairies. So he really created, it's not in the film, but he really created some of the first European ideas of what's there in the north, which was, of course, totally exotizing. And
that does lead us to another question that Tere put on the list of things that we might discuss, is the kind of north as mystical kind of guiding lights, and some. I mean, you think of Orientalism as being a kind of philosophy or a sensibility that has been attributed to a whole region of the world, with it having no part in creating it. It was created in the minds of historians in the Western world, and the North. We were also, we guided by the Northern Star, right? Where the North, you even ask somewhere here, you say, what is today's North, as if that was still we are guided by. Why is it the North? Is there something, you know how it is in anthropology, that for some reason the west side of a city is always where the wealthier side gathers. Is there something about the North that, and is there anything that we can do to change that? Or is there need to? But I found interesting, just to show you another example of what you've been doing, is a map of Europe upside down. So I think this would be, if you've ever seen this, it's currently, I mentioned it briefly at the beginning, was that there's currently a new name for Europe, and it's called Slumil Kajachem Kor, which means Tierra Insumisa. And there's the map of Europe like this, yes, which basically the Zapatistas in Mexico were being kind of like, the political class in Mexico was trying to turn things around and saying, we apologize for all the colonization by Spanish people of the Mexican indigenous people and so on. And they said, we don't want your apologies. We don't need any apologies from Europe. We would like you just to join us in kind of reimagining the world. And so they came with boats from Mexico. Actually, they first landed, I think, with only 20 or very small number of people by boat, like Columbus, I think on the same day, reversing the flow of people and trying to kind of recolonize Europe from Latin America. Is kind of interesting juggling of the North and the South. I find this kind of an interesting way of reorienting. What do you think? How does your exhibition work in this context?
Well, of course, it's directly connected, but it's also about, I think that the way you place things, they kind of like reconfigure your mindset. even, for example, when you think about like our system in writing, for example, in Easter Island, they used to have a system of writing that was called the Bustrofedon, that they started reading from the left in the bottom and going like zigzagging. And when you think of screens, they like normally the most expensive part is the right and in the left for the people in the West who read from left to right. So I think that the way things are placed, of course, they reconfigure the way you think of yourself. So in that way, when you're born like in the south of the world, I think that even when you're in school, sometimes teachers would tell you, well, don't expect anything here because you're in the, what is not a very nice expression, but they call it culo del mundo, so the kind of like ass of the world, because it's the last part of the world. And I think that actually limits people. I know that in Australian schools, I've been told that sometimes they do this exercise of turning the map, and I think it actually makes people think about their position in the world differently. And especially, I think that with digitalisation, the structures of the map don't really make sense anymore. There was I want to add two anecdotes. There was a very interesting podcast inspired in John Berger ways of seeing in the BBC, that they were, I can't remember exactly how, but they were narrating how even the connections of the internet are reconfigured, not like in the most practical way, but they still have a kind of like colonial presence because they go from one country to ex-colonies, like the cables in the sea for the internet. So there's something there that I find interesting in the way internet is configured around the world. But then the other thing is that when you speak about the stars, for me and I guess for Axel as well as a member of Global South, we have no idea about the stars of the North. I mean, I just saw them for the first time when I came to Europe. We have our Estrella del Sur, or like the Cruz del Sur, like the Cross of the South. That's called the Incas used to call it the Chacana. That's like a cross, and for that's our north in a way. So I think that when you think about stars, of course they look differently in different parts of the world.
Sorry, I have one funny story about the stars. We did once a book, and the idea was that the end papers at the beginning was about my work, and the first end papers would be the sky of Buenos Aires, where I came from, and the end papers would be the sky of Kilpisjärvi, where I had made a film. So I found out the scientific maps of the sky. I gave them to the designer, and she came back, and she had both end papers, and the editor was also from Argentina, and we were like, well, the sky of Buenos Aires looks perfect, totally a sky, we totally believe it, but the sky of the north, it doesn't look like a sky, it's like random. And then we told her, you have to fix this, and then she fixed it, and then it was wrong, and then, well, it was several iterations of which she couldn't get them right. And one day the samples were on my desk, and my wife walks by, who's Finnish, and looks at, oh, look, a map of the sky. And then we realized that, there had been nothing wrong from the beginning, it's just been such a weird sky for us that we couldn't recognize it as a sky.
Okay.
I have one thing. I was thinking what is your name?
Me, Teivo.
Teivo Teivainen.
Teivo Teivainen.
All right. I don't want to disturb or take any of your time, but one thing came to my mind when you were talking about that. Why I don't say we Finns, because I'm from Finland, of course, but I don't talk like we, because I'm only talking about myself, myself, me. Because one thing came to my mind. I was reading one book. I'm like really much the history. I read really much the history, and you can write your own history. You can talk, and I don't say anybody here is wrong about anything or nothing like that. But do you know? Because it popped in my mind that you might know what is the English name for the war called Suuri Pohjasota. Suuri Pohjasota. Do you know about that war?
I think it's normally called the Great Northern War.
Great Northern War. I think everybody here who is talking what Finnish people has done wrong to everybody should read the history and about that war, the Great Northern War. The Russian cavalry was destroying all Finland, and they were destroying whole Viborg town, and they were selling to slaves to Turkey all the
ended 300 years ago, and it's actually interesting related to this, because in Finland it's sometimes used, the debate is very either or, because now many people, it's coming up like Finland as a sort of colonizer, or Finland vis-a-vis the Sami, or stuff of participation of Finland somewhere, and then others say no, it has not, that's not possible, because in the Great Northern War the Russians came and Finns were taken as slaves, and it's either or and not both. It is true, Finns were enslaved by Russians in the Great Northern War, and it was really bloody and heavy and violent, and Finns were taken as slaves, exactly as you said. And then people who have this are like, but so because that happened, it cannot be true that we've been bad against the Sami, because that happened, it cannot be true, and all that. So the debate is.
Okay,
I'm not saying you were saying that. It was
okay,
a great.
good.
It was a great point.
Okay, sorry. So we have to continue. Just I think what we're getting here is like there are many histories, and we can't say that because we know one of them that explains all of them, right? And there are several histories. So thank you for contributing that. Of course, there's also the history of the Germans burning down Lapland, right? We know that's another history that is rather kind of hidden underneath the folds of history, that the Germans, when they were losing the war, rather burnt the country than leave it to the conquering powers that were liberating it from Nazism, if you like, from the point of view of post-war history. I think we should open the floor now to the audience. I would like to. There was a huge moment where we were also talking about the future, and I think I would like to try to get back to this question of how we deal with the future powers. And the future powers are no longer really the nation state as much as they were in the previous centuries, and how we deal with the rapacious destruction of our planet through corporate industry, and whether we can do something about that. Because we also have on this series of questions the fact that Latin America is one of the resources that is most preserving of our planet, the Amazon being, of course, just described as the lungs of the world, are currently being eaten up by our consumption of meat, for example. How do we face that future? Perhaps we could ask that question, and some of the other issues that you want to address as the audience would relate to the future. We have someone here.
Yeah, I would like to ask about the Teivo, you said about we want it to be white, and then I think in Finland we get stuck in the east and west. Now we're talking about north and south, but then I'm thinking about the Latin American perspective. Is we think about capitalism, communism, east and west, but there are a lot in Latin America that we could learn from, like Buen Vivir, and I'm wondering what do you, Tere, for example, think that in the future that the Latin American presence could come, and also Africa, anything that has to do with South, that could come present in this discussion, because we seem to be stuck in this global dialogue, especially in Finland, but we don't really know what exists in Latin America, such as Buen Vivir. And then I'm thinking about the corporate world and COVID. There's a lot of small businesses that are going bankrupt. People don't have food, especially, for example, in Brazil, and a lot of big corporations are coming there to take that platform. So I'm thinking, like, what do you see as quintessential in how we understand the world from your perspective, coming from Latin America? You mentioned before also as like communism didn't work and capitalism is a broken system, but such as Buen Vivir.
I think that the idea of the buen vivir, or the good living, is a bit of a kind of like utopian dream that the Europeans sometimes they have this exotic idea of the Latin Americans being very cheerful and happy, and I think that the reality is a bit more complex. So I think that's a bit of a kind of like projection of the dreams of the Europeans, of the nice things they see in Latin America, but it's maybe the things that they see when they travel for vacations, but not actually the reality you encounter when you live there. But for me, one of the things I appreciate a lot, and I've always feel grateful about coming from Latin America, is that I think that we have this concept called resourcefulness. And I think that as we grow up with more problems, we're more able to adapt to different circumstances. And for me, it has been a cultural shock when arriving to Europe, seeing how sometimes my peers were so comfortable in everything that if they have to do like a minimum effort, like, I don't know, in the college, if the technician didn't bring them the ladder, they would just stop there for an hour, not doing anything, until the ladder did not arrive to install the show. And for me, that's, I mean, as a Latin American, then if I don't have a ladder, I will maybe grab 3 chairs and do something to sort the problem out. But then for me, it has been like a cultural shock, because somehow I think it inhibits creativity. And also the other thing I appreciate a lot from Latin America is that I think that because we have this more maybe spontaneous way of living, because we are constantly encountering more problems because systems are not as regulated as here, I think we connect differently. So we somehow, it's what I would call maybe like the haptic sensitivity, or we have a more developed way of connecting like humanly with people. And I sometimes feel, especially in the UK with the health and safety, which on the one hand is good because it's true that you have less accidents, but on the other one I think that you inhibit like human creativity. And somehow I strongly believe that post-Descartes, with this kind of like over-rationalization of over-rational ideas, we have somehow inhibit intuition. And now with the climate crisis, I think we need to reapproach intuition in a way.
We have one question here, then one here. We plan to kind of go to 7 o'clock. I wanted to ask the audience if you want to spend a little more time. If your schedules are open, we can go on for another extra 10 minutes after. Okay, so if nobody's against it, we'll take a little bit more time. So, sir, up there.
Thank you. I'm Timo Heikka, and I have to say there are many points in my personal history and in my career in a big company also related. And I have a question about the theme, Neo Norte. Are we too late? I will tell you why I'm thinking so. And then this segregation will be over. Why I'm asking, are we too late to look at the South as something admirable to do, what we have done in the North? When I was a little boy, I was born in the river valley of Tornio. My family has been there 580 years, perhaps longer, but that's what we find documented. And when I was a little boy, I was traveling in the very, very poor part of Norway and Lapland fishing with my father. Now I'm being a director in a huge company, giving support to this as R&D director and many other things, working with things replacing plastics and so forth. So I have clients like you. My father was a war invalid, 6 members in the family, 4 boys. But I still, without any money in my family, I have had the best education. I speak 5 languages, 4, and write 5, and so forth. So I think this is something, folkhemmet, a home for the people, they said in Sweden. I have experienced that, and I highly value it. I have my own teeth without any money in my family. I'm 65 already. But are we too late looking now what has happened lately and what will happen? First in Sweden, it's not anymore folkhemmet, the home of the people. Segregation, class society, very heavily. I think we have at least certain signs of similar things happening here. So are we too late to give this kind of welfare state, equality and so forth example to the South? Neo Norte, the South. I don't know. But when I listened to in the very beginning, you, Teivo, said, and what you, Pirita, said, I know something about the things you said, and of course you exaggerated. I was 8 years as a researcher in the forestry. I know the overgrazing, amazing destroying of the land with overgrazing. I was looking Landsat satellites and the Russian side, and I went there up to the north. I've been born there. So exaggerations, they were exaggerated, but I still agree
About what?
I still agree in many points, but the main question is, are we too late to give a good example to the South as Nordic society? Sorry for the long comment and question.
I have a small comment. because yesterday I was discussing this in this poetry encounter with a Peruvian poet, and I think that it is difficult to replicate a model like the, because I've been almost a month here in Finland, so I've learned a lot about the culture, but I
You will have to replicate if you take some examples.
I mean, you can take some examples, but I don't think is a good way going forward. Like this poet yesterday, he was saying to me, the solution to Latin America is to hire 200 people from Sweden and just giving them the government of Peru for 30 years. And I said to him, that would be impossible, because people in Peru, do you think that they're going to not have music after 9 o'clock? Like that, people would not do that, and then you would have the Swedish trying to imprison these people for having the loud music. So it's difficult to think of replicating a model in a different culture. Of course, you can learn of things. It's never late. I think that.
And I think, I mean, it's very interesting kind of picture you've given of the North, because, of course, this hasn't always been the case. I mean, as you know, Norway was a very poor country before, and has been, managed to support its welfare system through massive exploitation of its natural resources, which has long-term damage to the rest of the world. So we have to realize that Europe's welfare state, which is it's a European thing, it's not a Nordic thing. And in a way, the Finnish welfare state, which came from the Swedish one, was, inspired pretty much by Bismarck, which was a very reactionary leader. So these are certainly not just Nordic concepts, but they're based on the immense riches which we receive by plundering the South. So there's a historic a kind of obligation of the North to recompense for all that damage that has been done, just like for the Sami. So I think this is where we are in a point in history. It doesn't mean that the models that we've built with those resources are wrong. It's a fantastic thing. Equality, less, forms of justice and so on. So that's my 2 cents in response to that. But I think there was one more question here. Teivo, did you want to have something to say in response to this gentleman?
Sorry, I would like.
Right, please, sir.
Look, I think I'm from Argentina. I'm from Buenos Aires, and we work together with Tere in this Neo Norte. The vision of Latin America is very contradictory. There's a lot of contradictions inside. Because, for example, from Argentina, we knew what is to be reached since the end of the 19th century. We've lost during the 20th century our wealth, but we really knew that. But also, I think that we are not looking for the Nordic countries or the Southern European countries, because we're a mixture of all that. We have a very important colony of Nordic society in Argentina, speaking of the country where I come from, and I know it very well. We have Swedish people, we have a small colony of Finns, we have Danish people, we have Norwegians, and we have a lot of points in contact with Finland, for example, because we are in the extreme south, Finland is in the extreme north. We have our original people, and we hid our original people until the middle of the 20th century, and then we are really very ashamed of that. Nowadays we are trying to put in our scenario, in our history, in our society, about our original people, studying their languages, preserving their lands. So we pass all through all these discussions during the 20th century. Also, Latin America is not a unity. It's so different, Chile from Argentina, we are neighbors, Uruguay, Brazil. Not only, the most important thing in common is that we have the same language, not with Brazil, but with the rest of the countries. And also, I think that South America did a very, very strong effort in, for example, recovering democracy at the mid of the 80s in the 20th century. We had, for example, Teivo knows it very well, we had a terrible Holocaust in Argentina between the 70s and the 80s. 30,000 disappearing people. That's too much. What I think is maybe, you know that the word Finland, not the country Finland, the word Finland had become in Argentina, for example, a synonym of excellence. Our politicians used to say this happens in Finland, and it's not true. That doesn't happen in Finland. But they use it as a model of something that's working well.
is because I think, and that is because we have the remembrance of the past, of what is to be a wealthy country. And we know very well how we lost also that wealthy during the 20th century. So what I think that's important for the Nordic people, and most part of the Europeans, Spanish people, French people, British people, Italians knows us better maybe, no? Because we have a very important community of we descend from most of these countries. But just to see which are the contact points. We have a lot of things in common, but we have to discover them. And maybe our original people should speak with the original people of Finland. And when I listen to your speech, I recognize many things that Mapuches and the Welches and Araucanos, that our original people would say exactly the same. So I think what we have to do is to promote that kind of dialogue. But thank you very much to you and to all the panelists. That was very, very nice.
Thank you very
Sorry,
much.
I just want to add one thing to what Sergio said. Because Finland is not only like the idea of excellence, of the idea of something that's really, really good, but so my sister, when she was just out of university, she was a staffer for someone called Claudio Lozano, Sergio would know, who was a very left-wing member of parliament. You know, the kind of person who was, you know, trying to enlarge maternity leave, create paternity leave, and so on. And every time my sister came up with, you know, I know that my brother in Finland is getting this, and so we should, you know, we should put whatever, 9 months maternity leave. And even in this kind of very left-wing, very ambitious context for, you know, developing services for the population, she was always told, this is not Finland. You know, we are not going to, you know, we are not going to go for 9 month maternity leave because this is not Finland. We're going to go for 3 months. Or we are not going to go for, you know, 1 month paternity leave. We're going just for 3 days. And when she was like, but we can do it more. This is not Finland. So Finland was always a condition of impossibility.
Can I say one couple of things? First, my name is Alejandro. I'm also Argentinian. I live here since 2001, so more than 20 years. I think that it's not too late. That's answering your question.
I mean, if we have lost all the good points and
yes,
that are good for any kind of exam, that's my point.
I think it's very important in Latin America to try to rebuild, I think is a good word to say, because there are two things that I see that is happening in Argentina. There is a loss of values. People that is losing the idea of what are the values of things. Yes, they put the scale is wrong. And also the other big risk is we are losing the respect. And without respect, you cannot build anything. If there is no respect among people, and this is very valuable in Finland, that the people, the first thing is to respect each other. Yes? And when someone disagrees with you for whatever reason, there is a respect. You hear what the other is saying. You may disagree, of course, but you hear and you understand. You try to understand the emotion. And in Argentina, this, at least when I have not been there for 3 years now, but this thing of not listening, I have my convictions and tell me what you say, but what you are saying is not wrong. These things are the ones that we have to be, let's say, rebuild, bring them back to the culture of Latin America in general.
I would agree. In my experience, I would say the biggest difference between the underdeveloped and the developed world, because still you have poverty in Europe. It's not like when you come to Europe, you realize, well, it's not so developed as I thought. But I would agree with you. I think that the thing we are most lacking in Latin America is respect. Because when you see the political debates, people don't even allow the opponent to finish the sentence, and they start interrupting him. And I think that here you see that even people have very contrary opinions, and at least they're able to listen. And I think that's the way of starting.
I can tell you one short anecdote I have at my office. That's we have a coffee at 9 in the morning, coffee break, just 9:15. And they are all Finns. I am the only Argentinian there. And sometimes I pass and I see them and they're all in silence. Full silence. And it can happen 1 minute that no one is talking. And in our culture, you could perceive this atmosphere as something ghastly, terrible. But in Finnish culture, this is perfectly normal. So sometimes I joke when I see them all in silence, and I said, there is one phrase I used to have in my office when I was working in Argentina that I could never use here with you, which is, please, can you talk one at a time? They're all silent.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a lot of hands up at the end here. This is very interesting. So the discussion is getting going. So can I know there's a lot of, can I just make a kind of little step further? So we started with this idea, can the Nordic world somehow still have something to give to the other countries in the world that perhaps was a model that is now been eroded, if not ruined by, if you like, neoliberal economics, I think, if to put a fine point on it. Right, and this is something Europeans don't really see, is that actually it's a very clear Americanization of the North before the rest of Europe. But I wanted to see it the other way around, since we're talking about Latin America. What do we have to learn from Latin America? And that was asked before. And I don't think it's just the joie de vivre kind of, language, or like we know how to kind of find a ladder when we need it, which is like, the French have the word, se débrouiller. It's any culture which, just get sorted out, That's what we do if you don't have this strict division of labor. But is there such a thing as, it flies in the face of everything that you believe, that the least developed, and we had this word just now, the least developed peoples of this world have the most to teach us. So the peoples of the Amazon have preserved the Amazon for thousands and thousands of years. The peoples of the north have preserved the forest for many, many thousands of years. How can we learn from those societies that have not developed these hyper-industrialized situations where the actual resource which we're actually sitting on is being destroyed? Now, that may change the dynamic of this discussion. I know that you all had points about the previous things, but can we perhaps go that direction for a moment?
Well, I think what you said connects well with what was said there. Maybe I'd like to defend what Timo said here, because people were saying, no, it's not too late. I say, yes, it's too late. It's always too late for it to be yesterday. So it's too late. So, and it's late for Finland and the North to be kind of thought of as the future. And because things are happening here that make us, as you said, perhaps class, society, precarization of labor, hybridization of cultures, impact of global rating agencies, of financial markets. So Finland is being Latin Americanized. Europe is becoming a bit more like Latin America, which means structurally things are happening here that people in Latin America and in the South may know more about, because they have more experience about cultural hybridization. Here, immigration, all that is kind of new. In Latin America, there's a debate since 500 years ago, and with all these other things, similar things. So in that sense, it's both. It's too late by definition. Is it good or bad is then another thing, but there are at least some good things about it happening, so that Finland or Swedes are even more arrogant about this, of course, are not the ones who are teaching the world, please be like us. Swedish Development Corporation is all about traditionally, we want to teach all the world to be so nice as we, the Swedes, are.
Yeah, please fit in our box.
And so for it to change the sort of global pedagogy of power, to change a little bit the North learning to learn from the South, I think it has some nice and democratizing dimensions, though it's not an either or, good or bad kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah, I wonder if it's, we don't know so much, we don't have, it's really difficult to read Latin American literature or history written by anybody from Latin America. Often they are written by people from Europe or United States, and I wonder if this is because we don't have access to information. So we're thinking, here we have another model for you to use that we produced in the North. So there you go, you're welcome.
Well, we're currently trying to get Oodi accepting a donation of Latin American books that were donated by Ricardo Lebel, an academic from University of Chile. So I'm trying to set this up.
It's great because it's one more way to introduce to another side.
Right.
But I think that part of that, for me, what was interesting is that in school, I have to learn about, let's say, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, the medieval times, the Renaissance, French Revolution, First World War, Second World War. I had to learn all the European history, even read about European literature. I think even more than what I had to learn about Latin America. Of course, I had to learn about the Mayas, the Aztec, the Incas, and the tribes from Chile, and like the story of Chilean independence, Argentina independence, and Peru independence. But I think we don't have as a topic in school Latin American theory. So we are taught, oh, you belong to the Western world, and we have to learn all the history of Europe. And I find it very interesting because as I arrive to Europe, sometimes people tell me, but why do you know those things? And I'm like, because I learned them in school. And they're kind of like very surprised, but I think that the educational system in a way is set up that we have to study all the Western story and read about the literature, because of course it's also part of our culture, because as Teivo was saying, it's a hybrid culture, but there's a stronger focus to learn about the Western culture than learning like Latin American theory. I mean, I never, nor in school, nor in university, had any subject about Latin American theory. So.
But I just have one more thing, because I think that what you're looking for does not exist. I studied art history in Buenos Aires, and it was impressive for me because I had some of the best art historians in the country as my teachers, and what we were taught, we were reading books made in the US, in Europe, in which theoreticians and historians were deriving theories from artworks, from art movements, from cultural movements. And what my teachers were doing was using the same theories that were derived in Europe and applying them to Latin America, instead of them themselves looking at local movements and deriving theories which could be different. And I even had discussions with not with my teachers, but with friends who are now professors at the same university. And what they were saying is the problem is that we still, like academia is still in some way global. And let's say a Latin American, Argentinian in this case, writer or historian who would come and talk on theories that let's say the Western world would recognize, but apply them to Argentinian movements will be a lot more accepted than someone who comes with a complete new theory that has nothing to do with what is being discussed in Europe. So there's this influence all the time happening. Of course, there's some people, you know, it's not total, but this is the general view.
Pirita, would you like to also jump in again?
Yeah, maybe I'll bring the indigenous view into this, and maybe two perspectives. So when we try to strengthen the indigenous people's rights, it's not only good for the indigenous peoples, but it's good for the whole world. So strengthening indigenous rights is good for all of us, because what indigenous peoples are trying to do is preserve biodiversity, combat climate change with indigenous knowledge, and to make sure that we are preserving the land and the nature to the next generation and the next and the next and the next generation. So in a way, I think it's a too narrow view that if you are trying to improve and strengthen the indigenous rights, it is only for a very small group of people, when it's actually our common interests that are aligned there. And specifically in Finland, why it would be important to strengthen indigenous rights and give more self-determination in terms of land use, for example, for the Sami, is exactly the reason that our land up in the north has been taken away from us bit by bit. There's been logging, there have been roads, there have been different industries coming, even tourism is taking land, and it is true that we are operating on smaller and smaller lands and have to try and take care of our reindeer in smaller and smaller lands, and new threats are coming in: mining, wind farms, and so on, that are stripping away the land that is already reduced a lot. And I want to mention one thing that maybe wasn't so clear in the beginning. So back in the day, we were able to migrate from what is now called Finland to what is now called Norway. But obviously we can't do that anymore. So we are restricted to very small parts of lands with our reindeer, whereas before we could use the lands in a more sustainable way, going across the borders and going to the seashore and so on. So that was my point. Working towards indigenous rights is good for all of us, and it's good for our biodiversity and for trying to do something about climate change. So thanks for all the support that you give to our struggles, because it's our common struggle, really.
The Sami live in Helsinki before the Finns. The Finns expelled the Sami from Helsinki. This is original.
Right. Indigenous people lived in many parts of the world, of course, including New York, Manhattan.
And the Finns came from abroad,
yes.
And they expelled the Sami from Helsinki.
I just had a signal from Oodi, library's technician. We have a great honor to be here, and I'd like to thank the technician for staying so long, that we're about to close soon. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Oodi and Matthias Rosenlund and Nina Holm for setting up the event, and the Embassy of Argentina and the University of Helsinki for supporting it. And once again, Tere Chad for convening our little panel here. Thanks very much, and I'm sure we'll have a lively discussion. As I understand afterwards, as I understand there's some good wine to be had at a certain bookstore that a friend of ours has an event with. Is it still on? Can you please inform us?
I think there is some wine available at
after Peruvian reading.
At what is, according to some measurements, the biggest bookstore in Finland now, the brand new Sivullinen Rosebud bookstore in Kaisaniemenkatu 5. I think the old people like myself remember it as where Pukeva used to be. Some people, a little bit younger people, remember is at where Kodin Anttila used to be. Younger people know it as the downstairs of the student library of the University of Helsinki, but it's not too far, and it's worth it.
And it's connected to a Latin American event, right? So that's why I mentioned it's not an ad.
Yes, it's a wonderful Maailmasta Toiseen Latin American art and culture and poetry literature festival that's been going on, and it's about to end also, and they've invited us to move there for some refreshments.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody, and please do join us. Thank you.
Thank you. Kiitos.
Thank you.